a block of chocolate sitting in your cupboard right now. Maybe it is up on the top shelf, behind the biscuits, the one you snap a couple of rows off on a Friday night, the one you quietly slip to the grandkids when their mum has your back turned, that lovely cold crack when it breaks, that familiar wrapper you have never once thought twice about grabbing it. But mate, I have been reading the backs of these wrappers, and a lot of what we call chocolate in this country is not really chocolate at all. This is not about being alarmist, it is about being honest. And the brands doing these things are the ones you see every week, in every countdown, every new world, and every Park and Save in the land. Go ahead and subscribe. Number 11 on the list of chocolate brands you need to take a closer look at is the Pams Milk Chocolate Block. The budget one in the wrapper that ends up in half the trolleys in the country because it is cheap and cheerful and only a couple of dollars. Now look, I want to be fair. Pams have never pretended to be a fancy chocolate, and there is no shame in wanting to feed your family without spending $12.50 on a single block. I get that, mate, I really do. But here is the thing that made me pause when I turned that wrapper over. The very first ingredient listed, the one there is more of than anything else, is sugar, not cocoa. Sugar. In real chocolate, the cocoa should be doing the heavy lifting, but in a lot of these budget blocks, the cocoa is way down the list. Sometimes sitting at a cocoa solids figure of around 25%, which is about as low as you can go and still legally put the word chocolate on the front. After the sugar, you get milk solids, and then you start seeing vegetable fats creeping in to do the job that cocoa butter is supposed to do. Cocoa butter is the expensive bit, you see, the bit that gives real chocolate that melt on your tongue at body temperature. And when a company swaps some of it out for cheaper vegetable fat, they save a fortune, and you get a duller, waxier mouthfeel that never quite melts the way it should. And do not be fooled by the low price into thinking you are getting a bargain, because when more than half of what you are chewing is sugar and cheap fat, the real cost per mouthful of genuine chocolate is not nearly as cheap as the sticker suggests. I am not saying it will hurt you to have a square now and then. I am saying that when you are paying for chocolate, you deserve to know that a good chunk of it is sugar and cheap fat dressed up in a familiar wrapper, and that the grandkids are getting a mouthful of the very same. Number 10 on the list of chocolate brands you need to take a closer look at is the Woolworths and Countdown own brand chocolate, the supermarket's own label block that sits right there at eye level where they know you will grab it. Now look, I want to be fair, because a supermarket owned brand is not automatically a bad thing, and sometimes you are genuinely paying less for the same stuff without the fancy marketing. But when I read this one closely, what struck me was how much of the block is made up of fillers rather than actual chocolate. You've got milk solids and whey powder, which is a leftover from cheese making, bulking the thing out, and a cocoa content that sits low enough that the chocolate flavour is really coming more from the sugar in the milk than from the bean itself. Then there is the soy lecithin, an emulsifier marked as E322 that helps everything blend together smoothly. Now soy lecithin on its own is not the villain of the piece. It is used in loads of foods, but its presence is a little clue, a little tell that the recipe has been engineered for cost and shelf life rather than for the pure pleasure of good chocolate. What bothers me, mate, is the quiet trust of it all. You see the name of your own supermarket on the front, the shop you have walked into every week for 30 years, and you assume they have done the thinking for you. But their job is to sell you a block for as little cost to themselves as they can manage. And a block padded out with whey and milk solids and a whisper of cocoa is exactly how they do that. And because it wears the supermarket's own trusted name, they do not even have to spend on advertising. So the corners they cut in the recipe go straight into their margin and not into your enjoyment. Turn it over. Read where the cocoa sits on the list. You might be genuinely surprised how far down toward the bottom it is quietly slipped. Number 9 on the list of chocolate brands you need to take a closer look at is Nestlé Aero, that bubbly block with all the little air pockets that the kids love because it feels like it disappears on your tongue. Now look, I want to be fair, because there is a bit of clever fun in a chocolate full of bubbles, and I am not going to pretend I have never enjoyed the novelty of it. But that novelty is exactly the problem when you stop and think about it. What you are being sold, quite literally, is air. They whip gas through the chocolate so the block puffs up, which means you are getting less actual chocolate for your money and more nothing. And to make chocolate that behaves like that holds those bubbles and survives the processing, you tend to need a heavily worked recipe with vegetable fats and emulsifiers doing the structural work rather than good cocoa butter. Then there is the flavour. A lot of these mass blocks lean on artificial vanilla, a synthetic version of vanilla made in a factory, instead of the real vanilla bean, because real vanilla costs real money and vanillin costs almost nothing. It is the difference between a home-baked sponge and a packet mix, mate. On top of all that, the cocoa content in an Aero is modest at best, so between the air, the vegetable fat, the synthetic vanilla and the sugar, you have got a product that is a triumph of food engineering and not much of a triumph of chocolate. Think about it for a second. You would be a bit annoyed if you bought a bag of crisps and found it was half full of air, and yet here we happily pay full chocolate money for a block they have deliberately puffed up with gas. It is fun, I will give it that, but fun and food are not the same thing, and you're paying chocolate prices for a mouthful of clever bubbles and not a great deal else. Number 8. On the list of chocolate brands you need to take a closer look at is not one single brand, but a whole category, and this one really gets my goat. I'm talking about the supermarket chocolate flavoured compound, the baking buttons and the melts and the cheap coating blocks that say chocolate flavoured on the front, rather than just chocolate. Now look, I want to be fair, and I understand these are often sold for baking, and they are cheap for a reason. But here is the bit that most people walk straight past. Under the Codex Alimentarius, the international food standard that FSANZ leans on here in New Zealand and Australia, for something to legally be called chocolate, it has to contain cocoa butter as its fat. That is the rule. Cocoa butter is what makes chocolate chocolate. The moment a manufacturer swaps that cocoa butter out for cheap vegetable fat, usually palm oil or palm kernel oil, the law will not let them call it chocolate anymore. So they have to call it chocolate flavoured or a compound or confectionery coating, and they are banking on you not noticing the difference between those two little words. That is the whole trick. It looks like chocolate, it is sitting right next to the chocolate, it is a fraction of the price, and the very name on the packet is a legal confession that it is not the real thing. And the truly sneaky part is where they hide it, on the outside of half the coated lollies and ice creams and biscuits in the shop. That shiny brown coating you assumed was chocolate all your life. 9 times out of 10 a compound built on vegetable fat. If you have ever melted one of these down and wondered why it went gluggy and greasy and never set with a proper snap, now you know. It was never chocolate. It was vegetable fat wearing a chocolate costume. And the label told you the truth all along, if only you had turned it over and read the fine print. Number 7 on the list of chocolate brands you need to take a closer look at is Nestlé Milkybar, the white one, the one marketed straight at the Littlies with a smiling cowboy for as long as I can remember. Now look, I want to be fair because the grandkids adore it and there is a sweetness to a childhood treat that I would never want to take away from anyone. But mate, I have to tell you something that surprised even me. White chocolate is barely chocolate at all. It contains no cocoa solids whatsoever, none of the actual brown cocoa mass that gives real chocolate its flavour and its goodness. What you have got instead is mostly sugar and milk solids held together with a bit of fat, and in the cheaper versions that fat is not even all cocoa butter. Then, to give it that vanilla note, you very often get artificial vanillin rather than the real bean. So when you strip it right back, a white chocolate button is essentially sweetened milk powder with some fat and a synthetic flavour, and the first ingredient once again is sugar. There is also the emulsifier question, because to keep something that's sweet and that's soft behaving nicely on the shelf you need your lecithins, and sometimes an emulsifier called PGPR, which I will say a great deal more about shortly. And here is what nags at me most. Of all the chocolate in the shop, this is the one pitched hardest at the smallest children, the cartoon cowboy and the bright wrapper aimed right at the wee ones at the checkout who cannot yet read an ingredient list to save themselves. I am not here to snatch the lolly out of a child's hand, I promise you. I am here to say that if you thought you were giving your grandkids chocolate, you were really giving them sugar and milk powder with a picture of a cowboy on the front, and it is worth knowing the difference before you reach for it every single day. Number 6 on the list of chocolate brands you need to take a closer look at is Toblerone, that great triangular ridge of a thing in the gold box that somebody always brings back from the duty free, the one shaped like the mountains. Now look, I want to be fair because there is a lot of history and a lot of genuine fondness wrapped up in that funny triangle, and the almond and honey nougat inside it is a proper treat. But Toblerone has form when it comes to quietly changing what is inside the box, while keeping the outside looking exactly the same. A few years back, they famously widened the gaps between the triangles to make the bar lighter without changing the price, and people were rightly cross about it because nobody likes being quietly shortchanged. But the bigger issue for us is what actually goes into the recipe. Like so many of these big international blocks, the ingredient list runs sugar first, then the cocoa, and you find milk fat and whey powder, padding it out, and vegetable fats sharing the load with the cocoa butter. There has also been ongoing concern across the industry about palm oil in these products, the same palm oil linked to the clearing of rainforest and the loss of habitat for orangutans and other creatures. And Toblerone has been named in those conversations more than once over the years. They even had to change the mountain picture on the front when the making of it shifted country, which just goes to show how much of what we buy is really about the story on the box and how little of it we ever stop to check. So when you snap off one of those little peaks, you are getting a sugar-led recipe with fillers and vegetable fat, sold to you on nostalgia and the romance of a Swiss mountain. Lovely story. Just read the box before you believe all of it, mate. Number 5 on the list of chocolate brands you need to take a closer look at is Hershey's, the big American import that has been turning up more and more on our shelves as the supermarkets chase the overseas lolly aisle look. Now look, I want to be fair, because plenty of folk have a soft spot for the taste of an American chocolate bar, and if you've been to the States, you might have brought the fondness home with you. But this is the one I want you to pay real attention to, because of the medals. In 2022 and 2023, Consumer Reports over in America tested a big batch of dark chocolate bars, and the campaign group As You Sow has been on about this for years. And they found that a number of chocolates, Hershey's products among those flagged, carried levels of cadmium and lead that gave the scientists pause. Cadmium tends to come up out of the soil into the cocoa plant, and lead seems to settle onto the beans after harvest during drying and handling, and neither of them is something you want building up in a little one's body over years of regular treats. Now these metals matter more for the young ones than for old codgers like me, because a small body carrying a small amount adds up to a great deal more over a lifetime of weekly treats. On top of the metals question, these mass American bars lean heavily on the emulsifier, PGPR, and on cheaper fats and a whacking great load of sugar. Now I am not telling you one bar will do you harm and the companies will rightly point out their products meet the safety limits set by the regulators. But when the grandkids are having a bit most weeks, and the testing keeps flagging the same names, a careful grandpa reckons it is worth choosing a cleaner block and keeping the imported novelty for very high days and holidays. Number 4 on the list of chocolate brands you need to take a closer look at is Cadbury Marvellous Creations, the loud one. The block absolutely crammed with jelly beans and popping candy and biscuit bits and goodness knows what else. Now look, I want to be fair, because it is meant to be a bit of chaos and fun, and there is a place in life for a daft, silly, over-the-top treat. But this one is where the sugar really runs right. When a chocolate is stuffed full of jellies and candy pieces, the sugar content goes through the roof, and the actual chocolate holding it all together is often the cheaper, lower cocoa end of the range, because they are counting on all the crunchy bits to carry the experience. So you end up with a genuinely enormous amount of sugar per serving, artificial colours making those jelly beans that unnatural bright, and a long ingredient list full of things you would never keep in your own pantry. Add to that the additives and emulsifiers needed to bind such a busy, complicated block together, and you have got something that is really more of a confectionery carnival than a chocolate. And that, I think, is the real sleight of hand. All that noise and crunch and colour is there to distract you from the fact that the chocolate underneath is nothing special at all. Cheap chocolate tarted up with lollies so you never stop to taste it properly. I'm not going to lie and say it does not taste fun, because the grandkids would call me straight out for fibbing. But fun once in a blue moon is a very different thing from a regular treat. And if this is the block that lives in your cupboard for the after school raid, I would gently ask you to have a proper read of just how much of it is sugar and colour and clever noise, and how little of it is actual honest chocolate. Number 3 on the list of chocolate brands you need to take a closer look at is the Mars bar, that old faithful in the black wrapper with the nougat and the caramel, the one that has been in the checkout queue tempting us for the better part of a century. Now look, I want to be fair, because a Mars bar is honest about being a lolly. It has never dressed itself up as a health food, and I have wolfed down my share over the years. But there are 2 things worth knowing. The first is the recipe itself, where sugar leads the way, glucose syrup follows, and the chocolate coating around the outside is a modest layer, often carrying vegetable fat and palm oil alongside the cocoa. And the second, and the bigger one for me, is where the cocoa comes from. Mars, along with Nestlé and Hershey, has been named in class action lawsuits filed in the United States over cocoa sourced from West Africa, where investigations have repeatedly documented child labour on the plantations that supply the big chocolate companies. Now these are serious legal matters still being fought over, and the companies say they are working hard to clean up their supply chains, and I dare say some of that effort is genuine. But the reports keep coming year after year of children kept out of school and set to work with machetes in the cocoa groves of the Ivory Coast and Ghana, and it is a hard thing to unknow once you have read it. When you hold that bar, it is worth a quiet thought that the beans inside may have been picked by hands no bigger than your own grandkids' hands in conditions none of us would ever wish on a child. That is not me shouting an accusation. That is me asking you to care where your treat came from, because I reckon you already do. Number 2 on the list of chocolate brands you need to take a closer look at is Nestlé KitKat, the 4-fingered wafer bar that half the country cracks open on their smoko break, the one whose whole personality is having a break and a bit of a rest. Now look, I want to be fair, because there is something genuinely lovely about the ritual of snapping the fingers apart, and I would not want to spoil anyone's cuppa. But let us think about what is actually in it. A KitKat is mostly wafer, which is to say flour and fat, and air, with a fairly thin layer of chocolate coating the outside. And in that coating you'll find sugar leading the list, milk solids, vegetable fat sharing the work with cocoa butter, and soy lecithin binding it all together. So a fair whack of what you are eating is not chocolate at all, it is biscuit dressed up in a chocolate coat. And then there is Nestlé itself, a company with a long history of run-ins over how it does business, from the infant formula scandals of decades past right through to being named, as I mentioned, in the cocoa child labour lawsuits in the United States. Nestlé has made all sorts of sustainability promises over the years, and I hope with all my heart they keep them, but a wise old head keeps one eyebrow raised until the promises turn into proof you can actually see. It is one thing to print a nice logo about ethical cocoa on the wrapper. It is another thing entirely to be able to trace every bean back to a farm where nobody's child was put to work to grow it. So next time you are on your break with your KitKat, enjoy the ritual by all means, but know that you are mostly eating sweetened biscuit wrapped in a thin skin of a modest chocolate, made by a company you might want to keep a careful eye on. Number 1 on the list of chocolate brands you need to take a closer look at, and it truly pains me to say it because so many of us grew up on it, is Cadbury Dairy Milk. That purple wrapper is stitched into the memory of nearly every Kiwi of a certain age, and I say what I am about to say, more in sorrow than in anger. Now look, I want to be fair, but you may remember, or you may be too young to remember, what happened back in 2009 when Cadbury quietly decided to replace some of the cocoa butter in their dairy milk with palm oil to save themselves a bit of money. When New Zealanders found out, there was an uproar the likes of which I have rarely seen over a chocolate bar. People were furious, not only because palm oil makes for an inferior, greasier chocolate, but because of what palm oil plantations were doing to the rainforests and to the orangutans of Borneo and Sumatra. There was a nationwide boycott, mate, a proper one, and Cadbury was forced into a humiliating backdown and had to promise to take the palm oil out again. Now that tells you something important. It tells you that when they think they can get away with it, the temptation to swap the good cocoa butter for cheap fat is always there, always sitting at the back of the boardroom waiting for a quiet year, when nobody is watching. And even today the dairy milk recipe leans on sugar as its first ingredient, uses the emulsifier PGPR, that is E476, to keep it flowing cheaply through the machines with less cocoa butter, and sits at a cocoa content far lower than you might imagine for something called dairy milk chocolate. The EFSA over in Europe keeps PGPR under review, as these additives always should be. I am not saying never have a square of the purple block, for old times' sake. I am saying remember 2009, and remember that a company that tried it once will always be tempted to try it again. Subscribe to show that these videos do help and do make sense. The first chocolate I'm happy to see in your trolley is Whittaker's, and you knew I was going to start here, did you not? This is the New Zealand icon, made in Pororua by a family that has been at it for well over 100 years, and there is a reason it is voted the most trusted brand in the country year after year. Whittaker's uses real cocoa butter, not palm oil and not cheap vegetable fat. and they have been proudly, loudly clear about that for a very long time. Their blocks carry a genuinely decent cocoa content. They use whole beans they roast and grind themselves rather than buying in someone else's cheap chocolate. And their fair trade and traceable cocoa commitments are the real deal, rather than a sticker for show. When you snap a piece of their creamy milk or their 62% dark, you get that proper clean melt on the tongue that only real cocoa butter gives you. It is a little dearer than the budget blocks, but you are paying for actual chocolate made by people who clearly give a damn, and that, mate, is money well spent. The second one I'm glad to recommend is Ocho, out of Dunedin down in the deep south, and this is bean to bar chocolate, which is a phrase worth learning. Bean to bar means the very same small company takes the raw cocoa bean and does every step itself, right through to the finished block, so nothing is hidden and nobody is quietly slipping in cheap fat behind your back. Ocho works closely with growers across the Pacific, places like Samoa and Bougainville and Vanuatu, and they can tell you exactly which island and often which farm your chocolate came from, which is about as far from a faceless factory block as you can get. Their ingredient lists are beautifully short, often just cocoa and a bit of sugar, no palm oil, no PGPR, no artificial vanilla, none of the engineering nonsense. It is a small operation making honest chocolate with real care, and every block you buy keeps a genuine New Zealand craft going and keeps a Pacific grower in fair work. That is a treat you can feel good about all the way down. The third is Wellington Chocolate Factory, up in the capital, another proper bean to bar outfit and one of the pioneers of the craft here in New Zealand. These are the folk who once sailed cocoa beans across the Pacific on a traditional sailing ship to prove you could bring your ingredients home without the carbon of the container trade, which tells you everything about how seriously they take the whole business. They work with fair trade and direct trade cocoa, paying growers properly rather than squeezing them, and they make their chocolate in small batches with real cocoa butter and clean, short ingredient lists. No vegetable fat pretending to be cocoa butter, no synthetic vanillin, no fillers bulking out the block. Yes, you will pay more than for a supermarket block, but you are buying transparency and ethics and genuine flavour and supporting a Kiwi business doing the hard, honest thing. It is the sort of chocolate you savour a square at a time, and that is rather the point of a good chocolate anyway. The fourth one worth your money is Bonetto, an organic chocolate brand that keeps things clean and simple and does it very well. Bonetto is certified organic and fair trade, which means the cocoa is grown without the heavy chemical load and the growers are paid a fair rate for their work. And both of those things matter to me more the older I get. Their blocks use real cocoa butter and carry a good honest cocoa percentage, and the ingredient lists are refreshingly short and free of the palm oil and the PGPR and the artificial flavours that clutter up the big commercial blocks. They do lovely dark varieties with things like coconut and orange and mint folded through, all naturally flavoured, so if you like a bit of variety without a chemistry set in the ingredients, this is a grand choice. It is proof that you do not need a factory full of additives to make chocolate taste wonderful. You just need good beans, real cocoa butter, and a company that will not cut corners, and Bonetto ticks every box. The fifth is Devonport Chocolates, up on Auckland's North Shore, a New Zealand maker that has been crafting proper chocolates by hand for decades. Now these lean more toward the boxed truffle and the fancy gift end of things rather than the everyday block. But that is no bad thing when what you are after is a real treat for a birthday or an anniversary, or just to spoil someone you love. What I like about them is the commitment to genuine ingredients, real cream, real cocoa butter, proper flavourings rather than the synthetic shortcuts, and the sort of care that only comes from small batch making by people who take pride in the craft. You are not buying a mass-produced bar off a conveyor belt run by robots. You are buying something a person actually made with their hands here in New Zealand, and that shows in every bite. Keep them in mind for when the moment calls for something special, because a small box of the real thing beats a giant block of the fake stuff every single day of the week. The sixth is Green and Black's Organic, which is an import, yes, but a good and honest one that you will find easily enough on New Zealand shelves. Green and Black's was one of the original organic and fair trade chocolate brands, built from the start on the idea that chocolate ought to be grown properly and traded fairly. And while it is owned by a bigger parent these days, the organic and fair trade certifications on the wrapper still mean something real. Their dark blocks in particular carry a good high cocoa content. Use real cocoa butter and skip the palm oil and the cheap fats. The 70% dark is a lovely thing, deep and proper, and because it is organic, you know the cocoa was grown without the worst of the chemical sprays. If you want a widely available block that you can grab in an ordinary supermarket run without hunting through specialty shops, and still trust what is in it, Green and Blacks is a very safe and sensible pair of hands to reach for, mate. And the 7th chocolate I am glad to put in your trolley is Lindt Excellence Dark. And here I want to be specific because it is the Dark Excellence range I mean, not the sugary filled ones. The Excellence bars come in cocoa strengths from 70% right up to 85 and 90 and even 99% for the truly brave. And the higher you climb, the more it is real cocoa and cocoa butter and the less it is sugar. At those strengths, the sugar is low, the flavour is deep and grown up, and a couple of squares genuinely satisfies you in a way a whole block of the sweet stuff never quite manages. Real cocoa butter, a proper cocoa content, and none of that greasy vegetable fat aftertaste. It is widely available, it will not cost you the earth, and it is a fine everyday dark chocolate for the grown-ups in the house. Start at the 70% if you are not used to dark and work your way up as your taste comes round to it, which it will, I promise you. So there you have it, mate. 11 blocks to turn over and read properly before you trust them, and 7 you can reach for with a clear conscience. And I know it is a lot to take in when all you wanted was a bit of chocolate. But here is what I would leave you with. You do not have to be perfect about it. Nobody is saying never let the grandkids have a treat again, because life is meant to have a bit of sweetness in it. All I am asking is that you know what you are handing them. Turn the wrapper over. Look for real cocoa butter and not palm oil. Look for cocoa near the top of the list and not sugar. Look for a company that tells you where its beans came from and how the people who grew them were treated. That is all. A few extra seconds in the aisle, a few dollars more for the real thing, and a little more care for the ones you love. I am a grandpa. And grandpas worry. It is right there in the job description. So do this old fella a favour and read the wrapper next time. Look after yourself and look after those grandkids of yours.